The encounter. Mia Collins, a bright, ambitious 18-year-old, was excitedly preparing for her mom's birthday. As the daughter of Marcus Collins, a respected FBI agent, she had learned many lessons about strength, courage, and love from both her parents. That day, Mia had her heart set on finding the perfect gift, something special to show her appreciation for all the sacrifices her mom had made. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the busy streets of the city buzzed with life. Maya felt the warmth of the sun on her face as she made her way toward the jewelry store on the corner. She had saved up for weeks, hoping to surprise her mom with a stunning necklace she'd seen in the store's window display on a previous visit. As she entered the store, a soft chime rang, and she was greeted by a friendly saleswoman. The store was filled with glittering pieces of jewelry, and Maya felt a rush of excitement as she browsed the selection. Her eyes landed on a delicate necklace with a sapphire pendant, its deep blue reminding her of the ocean, something her mother loved. She carefully examined it, imagining the smile on her mom's face when she opened the gift. Just as Mia was about to ask the saleswoman to wrap the necklace, a sudden wave of discomfort washed over her. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a man standing near the entrance. He was tall, with a hard-set jaw, and wore a police uniform. Officer Darren Wilkins, a man who was known around the neighborhood for being aggressive, especially toward people of color. Maya felt his eyes on her, scrutinizing her every move. She tried to shake off the feeling, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong. But as she handed the necklace to the saleswoman, the atmosphere in the store shifted. Whispers began to circulate between the sales staff, and the officer moved closer, his hand resting on the radio attached to his chest. "Excuse me, young lady," Officer Wilkins called out, his voice dripping with suspicion. Mia turned around, startled by the sharpness in his tone. "I'm going to need you to step outside with me for a moment." Mia's heart raced. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to remain calm. The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "We've had a report of theft. A necklace is missing from the display, and I need to check your belongings." Mia's face flushed with disbelief. "I didn't take anything," she said firmly. "I've been looking for a gift for my mom. That's all." The officer's face hardened. "We'll see about that. Empty your pockets." Feeling the weight of the judgmental stares from the staff and customers, Mia's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and a few coins from her pockets. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. She had always been taught to trust authority, but now she found herself at the mercy of a man who seemed to have already decided she was guilty. As the officer searched through her belongings, the saleswoman spoke up. "I didn't see her take anything, officer. She was just looking at the necklaces." But Officer Wilkins ignored her, his focus entirely on Mia. "Hand me your bag," he demanded. Mia's heart sank as she handed over her bag, knowing there was nothing inside but her wallet and a few personal items. The crowd outside the store had begun to gather, their whispers growing louder as they watched the scene unfold. Wilkins rifled through her belongings, his expression unchanging. When he found nothing, he stepped back, his frustration evident. "Must have been good at hiding it," he muttered under his breath. Tears welled up in Mia's eyes, not from fear, but from the humiliation she felt. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal because of the color of her skin. "I want to call my dad," Maya said, her voice shaking. "He's an FBI agent. He can help clear this up." Wilkins chuckled darkly. "Sure, call your dad. But if you think flashing your connections is going to get you out of this, you're sorely mistaken. You're coming down to the station with me." Mia's world spun as the reality of the situation hit her. She knew her dad, Marcus, would be furious when he found out what had happened. But right now, she felt powerless, trapped in a situation that seemed to be spiraling out of control. With trembling hands, Maya reached for her phone to call her father. Her voice cracked as she left him a message, praying he would come quickly. She had no idea what Officer Wilkins had in store for her, but she knew that her father would move heaven and earth to protect her. The Awakening. Marcus Collins, a tall, stoic man in his mid-40s, sat at his desk in the FBI field office, his mind deep in the complexities of a cybercrime case. His sharp eyes scanned the data on his computer screen, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the keyboard as he worked through the intricate details of the investigation. Marcus was known for his focus and dedication, qualities that had earned him respect both inside and outside the bureau. But at that moment, his phone buzzed on the desk, and something in the pit of his stomach told him it wasn't just a routine call. Glancing at the screen, he saw Mia's name flash across it. He reached for the phone, expecting to hear her excited voice, talking about finding the perfect gift for her mother. Instead, he heard the trembling voice of his daughter, caught between fear and panic. "Dad, I'm at the store. The cop says, I stole something. I didn't do anything. Please, come." Marcus's hand clenched around the phone, the weight of her words hitting him like a tidal wave. He stood up so fast that his chair tipped over behind him, the screech of metal against the floor cutting through the air. His colleagues looked up, startled, but Marcus was already moving toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew his daughter wasn't one to cry wolf. If Mia said there was a problem, then it was serious. "Hang tight, Mia. I'm on my way," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The drive to the store felt like an eternity. His mind raced, filled with a toxic mixture of anger, fear, and frustration. He knew all too well the challenges Black families faced when dealing with law enforcement. He had spent his career fighting for justice in a system that often treated people like him and his family as less than. But to know that it was happening to Mia, his baby girl, was like pouring gasoline on the simmering coals of his long-held frustrations. As he pulled up to the jewelry store, the sight that greeted him only fueled his anger. A small crowd had gathered, their phones out, recording the scene as Mia stood, her shoulders hunched, tears streaming down her face, while Officer Darren Wilkins hovered over her, his stance rigid and authoritative. Wilkins had Mia's bag in one hand and was gesturing toward her with the other, as if he were delivering a lecture instead of an accusation. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pushed through the crowd, his presence commanding attention. The whispers of the onlookers grew louder, but he blocked them out, his focus solely on his daughter and the man who was humiliating her. "Mia," he called, his voice sharp and clear. Mia's tear-filled eyes met his, and relief washed over her face as if she had just been pulled from the edge of a cliff. Officer Wilkins turned to face Marcus, a sneer forming on his lips. "Who are you? This is a police matter. Stay back." Marcus stepped forward, his broad shoulders and calm demeanor a stark contrast to the agitation that Wilkins projected. "I'm her father," Marcus said, his voice low and measured. "And I'm also a special agent with the FBI." Wilkins's eyes flickered with uncertainty for a moment before he crossed his arms over his chest, trying to maintain his composure. "Well, agent or not, your daughter's been caught in a theft investigation, and we're taking her down to the station." Marcus clenched his jaw, the rage simmering just beneath the surface. "She hasn't stolen anything," he said, his voice deadly calm. "And you have no right to detain her without cause. I suggest you step aside before you make this situation worse for yourself." Wilkins bristled at Marcus's words. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a black man. The arrogance in his posture was undeniable, but so was the slight tremor in his hand as he gripped Mia's bag tighter. "I don't care who you are," Wilkins snapped. "We have witnesses who say—" "Witnesses?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Witnesses who saw what, exactly?" "My daughter browsing for a gift for her mother. Or maybe witnesses who decided, based on her appearance, that she was guilty without any evidence." The tension between the two men was palpable, and the crowd watched in silence, sensing that something much larger than a simple misunderstanding was unfolding. Wilkins's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Marcus continued. "You've already violated my daughter's rights," Marcus said, stepping closer, his voice dripping with barely contained fury. "You publicly humiliated her without proof, searched her belongings without a warrant, and now you want to take her to the station without cause. Let me make this very clear. You are on thin ice, officer. If you don't back off right now, I will make sure this becomes a federal investigation. You will not only lose your badge, but you'll also face charges for unlawful detention and racial profiling." The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. The crowd, once murmuring and recording, had fallen into an uneasy silence. Mia, standing behind her father, watched in awe as he calmly dismantled the officer's authority with facts and sheer willpower. This was the side of her father she had always admired, but rarely seen in action. The protector, the advocate, the man who fought for justice. Wilkins, his face now a deep shade of crimson, hesitated for a long moment. He knew Marcus wasn't bluffing. The FBI had far more power than the local police, and if he wasn't careful, this situation could spiral out of control. With a huff, he tossed Mia's bag back toward her, his eyes burning with anger and resentment. "Fine," Wilkins muttered, "but I'll be filing a report on this." "You do that," Marcus said coolly, not taking his eyes off the officer until he turned and stomped back to his squad car. The moment Wilkins was out of earshot, Marcus turned to Mia, his expression softening. He pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close as she let out a shaky breath, her tears dampening his jacket. "It's okay, baby girl," he whispered. "I've got you." Mia held onto her father, her heart swelling with gratitude and relief. In that moment, she realized that no matter how terrifying the world could be, she would always have her father by her side, fighting for her, standing up against the injustices that tried to tear them down. But as they walked toward Marcus's car, both father and daughter knew this wasn't over. Wilkins might have backed off for now, but the damage was done, and Marcus would make sure there were consequences. What had started as a shopping trip for a birthday gift had turned into a battle for respect and dignity, a battle Marcus was ready to wage with everything he had. As they drove away, Marcus's mind was already racing with the next steps. He would file formal complaints, contact the district attorney, and ensure that Officer Wilkins faced the repercussions of his actions. But deep down, Marcus knew this fight was about more than just one cop. It was about a system that needed to change, and Marcus was determined to be a part of that change. For Mia, for himself, and for every other black person who had been unjustly targeted. The aftermath. The drive home from the jewelry store was a silent one. Mia sat in the passenger seat, staring out of the window, her thoughts swirling with the events of the past hour. She couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation, the accusatory eyes of Officer Wilkins, the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Her father, Marcus, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched, but his focus remained forward, his eyes locked on the road as though it was the only thing keeping his anger in check. The air in the car was thick with unspoken words. Mia wanted to ask her dad how often he had faced moments like this, how many times he had been judged before he even opened his mouth because of the color of his skin. She wanted to know if he was as scared as she had been, or if his years as an FBI agent had taught him to suppress that fear, to transform it into something else, something powerful, like the way he had confronted Officer Wilkins without backing down. But she didn't ask. The silence felt safer for now, less fragile than the question she wanted to pose. They pulled up to their modest home, the same house where Mia had grown up, surrounded by love, safety, and the unwavering support of her parents. It was a place that had always felt like a fortress, but now, even that felt different. The weight of the day still lingered in her chest as she got out of the car and followed her father inside. As soon as they entered, Mia's mom, Rachel, was waiting in the living room. She could tell something was wrong from the way Marcus's face was set like stone. Her eyes shifted to Mia, who was still pale, her usually bright eyes clouded with emotion. Rachel rushed over, her arms wrapping around her daughter, pulling her into a protective embrace. "What happened?" she asked softly, brushing Maya's hair back, as though the simple act could erase whatever had hurt her child. Mia squeezed her eyes shut, the warmth of her mother's arms loosening the tight knot in her chest. "It was nothing, Mom," Maya said quietly, her voice still shaky. "It was just a misunderstanding at the store." Rachel glanced over Mia's shoulder, her eyes locking with Marcus's. He shook his head slightly, his expression dark. "I wouldn't call it a misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice low but charged with a controlled fury. "It was racial profiling. Plain and simple." Rachel's face hardened. She knew this world too well. As a black woman married to a man who had fought his way through the ranks of law enforcement, she had seen more than her share of injustice, both on the streets and in the very systems that were supposed to protect them. But hearing that it had happened to her daughter was like a punch to the gut. Mia, feeling the tension between her parents, stepped back and tried to force a smile. "I'm okay, really. Dad got there in time, and nothing bad happened." Rachel's hand rested on Mia's cheek, her eyes softening. "You shouldn't have to be okay with this," she said. "This should never have happened to you." Marcus nodded in agreement. "It won't happen again," he said firmly. "I'm going to make sure of that." Mia frowned. "Dad, I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it already is. I just want to forget about it." But Marcus shook his head. "It is a big deal, Mia. You were humiliated in front of an entire crowd because of an assumption. That officer needs to be held accountable. If we don't stand up now, he'll do it again to someone else. Maybe next time, it won't end as peacefully." The word peacefully hung in the air like a specter, a reminder of how easily things could have escalated if Marcus hadn't arrived when he did. They all knew the stories, the countless names that had become hashtags, black men and women who hadn't made it home after encounters with police. Mia hesitated, torn between wanting to move on and knowing her father was right. She hated the idea of stirring up more trouble, but she also hated the thought of Wilkins doing this to someone else. "What are you going to do?" Maya asked. Marcus's eyes darkened, the gears of his mind already turning. "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the department, and I'm going to reach out to some people in the bureau who deal with cases like this. Wilkins won't just get a slap on the wrist. He'll have to answer for what he did." Mia swallowed, feeling both relieved and anxious at the thought of her father's next steps. She trusted him implicitly, but she also knew how these things could spiral. Still, she couldn't ignore the tiny spark of pride that flickered inside her. Her dad wasn't just protecting her. He was fighting for something bigger, something that went beyond their family. That evening, as Marcus sat at his desk, drafting the complaint, he couldn't help but think about all the other times he had been in similar situations. How many times had he been pulled over for driving while black? How often had his authority been questioned, even when he showed his badge? It was a lifetime of microaggressions, of moments that chipped away at his dignity, but he had always pushed through. Now it was different. Now it was about Mia. He finished typing and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew filing a complaint was only the first step. The real battle was going to be making sure it was taken seriously. The next day, Marcus walked into the local police station, his stride purposeful and determined. The officer at the front desk looked up as Marcus approached, his bored expression shifting slightly as he recognized the FBI badge on Marcus's hip. "I need to speak with your chief," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer hesitated. Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one," Marcus replied, locking eyes with the man. "Tell Chief Anderson that Special Agent Marcus Collins is here to file a formal complaint against one of his officers. It's urgent." Within minutes, Marcus was led into a small office where Chief Anderson, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tired expression, sat behind a cluttered desk. He rose as Marcus entered, extending a hand. "Agent Collins, I've heard about you," Anderson said, though there was a note of caution in his voice. "What brings you to my station?" Marcus didn't take the offered hand. He stood straight, his gaze unwavering. "One of your officers, Darren Wilkins, racially profiled my daughter yesterday and publicly humiliated her in front of a crowd. I'm here to make sure that doesn't go unpunished." Chief Anderson's face tightened, and he sat back down, motioning for Marcus to do the same. "Let's discuss this." "I'm not here to negotiate," Marcus said, ignoring the chair. "I'm filing a complaint, and I expect an investigation to follow. I also expect Wilkins to face the consequences of his actions." The chief sighed, leaning forward. "Look, I understand you're upset, but these things can be complicated. I know Darren, and he's a good cop. Sometimes misunderstandings happen. I'm sure your daughter wasn't treated unfairly on purpose." Marcus's expression didn't change. "Is that how you handle complaints here? Dismissing them as misunderstandings before you've even investigated?" Chief Anderson held up a hand defensively. "I'm not dismissing anything. I'll open a file, and we'll look into it." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Make sure you do, because if you don't, I'll make sure this goes public. My daughter isn't just a number in a file, Chief, and neither am I." With that, Marcus turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the chief sitting in stunned silence. The struggle for justice. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Despite Marcus's calm exterior, the weight of the battle ahead bore down on him heavily. He knew that getting justice in cases like these was never straightforward. Even though he had filed a formal complaint against Officer Wilkins, Marcus had been in law enforcement long enough to know that the system had a way of protecting its own. He'd seen it time and time again. Complaints buried in bureaucracy, investigations delayed indefinitely, and officers exonerated without consequence. Mia, meanwhile, tried her best to move on. She resumed her classes, met up with friends, and avoided talking about the incident with her parents. But the memory lingered like a dark cloud that refused to lift. Every time she walked past the jewelry store, she felt a chill run down her spine. The same store she had once viewed as a place to find a gift for her mom was now a symbol of shame, fear, and injustice. The whispers of strangers, the accusing stares, those were the things that haunted her most. At school, Mia noticed the subtle change in the way people looked at her. Some of her classmates had seen the video clips that had circulated on social media. It wasn't a viral sensation, but it had made its way around certain circles. She heard the murmurs in the hallways, the quiet speculation about what had really happened. Was she guilty? Had her father used his power to bail her out? One afternoon, as she sat in the cafeteria, she overheard two girls at a nearby table whispering. "I heard she tried to steal something from the jewelry store," one girl said it in a low voice, glancing over at Mia. "But her dad's in the FBI, so he covered it up." "That's not true," the other girl replied, but her tone was hesitant, as if she wasn't entirely sure. Maya's stomach clenched, and her appetite vanished. She stood up abruptly, leaving her tray untouched, and walked out of the cafeteria. It didn't matter that the truth was on her side. Perception was powerful, and once rumors started, they were hard to dispel. Meanwhile, Marcus's fight with the police department was proving to be more complicated than he'd anticipated. Chief Anderson had promised to open an investigation, but days passed without any word. Marcus followed up with phone calls, emails, and even an in-person visit, but the responses he received were evasive. "It's under review," the chief said during one particularly frustrating phone call. These things take time. Marcus had heard that phrase too many times before. Under review was code for, "We're hoping you'll get tired of pushing and let it go." But Marcus wasn't the kind of man who let things go. Not when his daughter's dignity, and the broader fight for justice, was on the line. After another week of silence, Marcus decided to escalate. He reached out to a colleague in the bureau who specialized in civil rights investigations. It was a risky move, navigating the delicate balance between working within the system and exposing its flaws. But Marcus knew that if he didn't push harder, the complaint against Officer Wilkins would be swept under the rug. He met with his colleague, Special Agent Janelle Hughes, in a quiet coffee shop downtown. Janelle was known for her no-nonsense approach to civil rights cases, and Marcus trusted her judgment. "This isn't just about Wilkins," Marcus said, leaning forward, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "It's about the culture in that department. This isn't the first time I've heard about racial profiling from them, but they've always managed to cover their tracks." Janelle nodded thoughtfully, tapping her fingers against the table. "You're right. Cases like this don't exist in a vacuum. But if you want to go after systemic issues, we need to build a stronger case. A single complaint won't cut it. We need a pattern of behavior, more victims willing to speak out." Marcus sighed. "That's the problem. People are afraid. Most of them don't want to come forward, especially if it means going up against law enforcement." Janelle's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll have to find a way to encourage them. We can't let this slide, Marcus. If we let Wilkins off the hook, he'll keep doing what he's been doing, targeting young black people, harassing them, using his badge as a weapon." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. "I won't let that happen." Later that night, as Marcus sat in his office, reviewing case files and preparing his next steps, Rachel knocked gently on the door. She stepped inside, her expression soft but concerned. "You've been at this all night," she said, coming to stand behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. "You need to take a break." "I can't stop now, Rach," Marcus replied, his voice tired but determined. "They're stalling. They're hoping I'll back down." Rachel sighed, pulling up a chair beside him. "I know, but you can't carry this fight alone. What about Mia? Have you talked to her? She's been quiet since all this started, and I think it's eating at her." Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "She's trying to be strong. She doesn't want us to worry about her." Rachel shook her head. "She's hurting, Marcus. You know how sensitive she is, how much she cares about what people think. This whole situation, it's changed her. She's not the same carefree girl she was a few weeks ago." Marcus felt a pang of guilt. In his drive to pursue justice, he hadn't considered how deeply the incident had affected Mia on an emotional level. He had been so focused on the legal and systemic battles that he hadn't realized the toll it was taking on his daughter. "I'll talk to her," Marcus said quietly. "I've been so caught up in this fight. I didn't see how much she's struggling." Later that evening, Marcus knocked on Mia's bedroom door. She was sitting on her bed, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen's soft glow. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. "Hey, Dad," she said, setting her phone aside. "Hey, sweetheart," Marcus replied, sitting down on the edge of her bed. There was a moment of silence between them, heavy with the things neither of them had said. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked gently, his eyes searching hers. Mia shrugged, pulling her knees up to her chest. "I don't know. It's weird. Everyone's talking about it. And I just want it to go away." "I know," Marcus said, his voice soft. "I know you're going through a lot right now, and I'm sorry I didn't check in with you sooner. I've been so focused on making sure that Cop pays for what he did, but I should have been more focused on you." Mia looked away, blinking back tears. It's not fair. I didn't do anything wrong, but everyone's acting like I did. And even though you're trying to make things right, it still feels like, I don't know, like it'll never be enough. Like people will always see me as the girl who got arrested for nothing." Marcus reached out and gently took her hand. "You did nothing wrong, Mia, and anyone who thinks otherwise doesn't know the truth. But I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. I'm not letting this go, and I'm not letting that officer get away with what he did. This is about more than just you, though. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Mia nodded, though her expression was still conflicted. "But what if it doesn't change anything? What if nothing we do makes a difference?" Marcus squeezed her hand. "It will. It might take time, but change doesn't happen overnight. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, And I need you to know that no matter what happens, I'm proud of you. You've handled this with so much grace, even when you didn't have to. And I'll always be here, fighting for you." A tear slipped down Mia's cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, nodding as she leaned against her father. In that moment, she realized that no matter how hard things got, she wasn't alone in this fight. And even though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew she had the strength of her family behind her. The turning point. The days stretched into weeks, and Marcus's frustration grew with each passing moment. Despite his relentless pressure on the local police department, it seemed that Chief Anderson was content to drag his feet, hoping that the issue would quietly fade away. But Marcus was not the type to let things slip into oblivion. He had dedicated his career to fighting for justice, and this time it was personal. The complaint against Officer Wilkins had been filed, but the wheels of bureaucracy were turning too slowly for his liking. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in his office, sifting through documents and making yet another call to the police department, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Janelle Hughes, his colleague who specialized in civil rights cases. The message was short but urgent. "Meet me. There's something you need to see." Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his keys and drove to the cafe where he and Janelle had met before. When he arrived, she was already seated in a booth at the back, her face set in a determined expression. She had a laptop open in front of her, and she waved Marcus over without wasting any time on pleasantries. "You're going to want to sit down for this," Janelle said, her voice low as Marcus slid into the booth. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What did you find?" Janelle turned the laptop toward him and pressed play. The video that filled the screen wasn't the familiar footage of Mia's encounter with Officer Wilkins. This was something else. It was bodycam footage from Wilkins himself, footage that the department had failed to release despite Marcus' repeated requests. The video showed Wilkins interacting with other citizens, black citizens, and the pattern was unmistakable. Time and again, Wilkins targeted young black men and women, pulling them aside, harassing them, accusing them of crimes with little to no evidence. There was one scene in particular that made Marcus's blood boil. A teenage boy, no older than Mia, being handcuffed while pleading his innocence as Wilkins sneered down at him. Janelle paused the video, her expression grave. "This isn't an isolated incident, Marcus. Wilkins has a history of this kind of behavior, and the department has been covering for him. That's why they've been stalling. They're trying to bury it." Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. "How did you get this?" "A source inside the department," Janelle replied, her voice a little tense. "It's risky for them to share this, but they wanted you to see it. They want Wilkins gone as much as you do, but the higher-ups are protecting him. It's the old boys club, and they don't want one of their own going down, even if he's a liability." Marcus clenched his fists under the table. He wasn't just dealing with a rogue cop. He was dealing with an entire system that was built to protect officers like Wilkins, even when they were a danger to the very community they were supposed to serve. "So what's our next move?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. Janelle gave him a grim smile. "We make it public. They've been stalling because they think they can control the narrative. But once this footage is out there, they won't be able to hide anymore. We take this to the media, put pressure on the department from the outside." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind already working through the logistics. "It's going to get messy." "It always does," Janelle replied. "But if we don't do this, nothing changes. Wilkins will keep harassing people, and the department will keep covering for him." Marcus's eyes hardened with resolve. He thought of Mia, of that day in the jewelry store when her life had been turned upside down because of one man's prejudice. He thought of all the other young people who had been victimized by Wilkins, and of how many more there would be if no one stood up to stop him. "Let's do it," Marcus said firmly. "I'll handle the media." 2 days later, the story broke. Major news outlets picked up the bodycam footage and the details of Wilkins' history of racial profiling. Marcus, alongside Janelle, gave interviews to reporters, carefully laying out the evidence they had gathered. The footage was undeniable. Wilkins's behavior was consistent and disturbing, and the fact that the department had tried to bury it only made the story more explosive. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media erupted with outrage, not only at Wilkins but at the entire police department for its role in protecting him. Protests were organized outside the police station, with signs that read "Justice for Mia" and "End Racial Profiling." The story resonated with people who had experienced similar incidents, and soon other victims of Wilkins began to come forward, sharing their stories of harassment and abuse at his hands. At home, Mia watched the news coverage with a mixture of shock and relief. For weeks, she had felt isolated in her experience, convinced that she was just an unfortunate exception. But now, seeing the outpouring of support and hearing from others who had been targeted by Wilkins, she realized she wasn't alone. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Mia turned to her father. "Do you think this will really change things?" she asked quietly. Marcus, who had just gotten off the phone with another reporter, looked at his daughter and smiled softly. "I think it's a start," he said. "People are paying attention now. And once people see the truth, it's a lot harder for the system to keep covering it up." Mia nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. For the first time since the incident at the jewelry store, she felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, something good would come out of this nightmare. But the fight was far from over. As the protests grew and public pressure mounted, the police department finally responded. Chief Anderson held a press conference, standing before a sea of cameras with a carefully prepared statement. "We take all allegations of misconduct seriously," Anderson began, his face carefully composed. "In light of the recent evidence brought to our attention, Officer Darren Wilkins has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." The words felt hollow to Marcus as he watched the broadcast. He knew what administrative leave meant. It was a temporary measure designed to calm public outrage without actually holding the officer accountable. Wilkins wasn't fired, and there was no mention of criminal charges. As the press conference continued, Anderson shifted the narrative, framing Wilkins's actions as isolated incidents and reaffirming the department's commitment to upholding the highest standards of integrity. Marcus turned off the TV, his jaw tight with frustration. "They're still trying to protect him," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Janelle called him that evening. "What did you think of the press conference?" she asked, her voice tinged with irony. "They're stalling again," Marcus replied. "They think they can weather the storm by putting him on leave and waiting for things to die down." "Well, we're not going to let them," Janelle said. "We've got more people coming forward. And now that the media's involved, we have leverage. We need to push harder." Marcus agreed. "We keep the pressure on. They can't hide behind administrative leave forever." As the investigation into Wilkins's conduct continued, Marcus and Janelle worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering more testimonies and keeping the story alive in the media. The protests outside the police station grew larger, with community leaders joining the call for justice. The longer the department dragged its feet, the angrier the public became. For Marcus, the fight had become about more than just justice for Mia. It was about dismantling the system that allowed officers like Wilkins to operate with impunity. It was about making sure that no other black father had to stand outside a jewelry store, watching his daughter be humiliated for a crime she didn't commit. It was about ensuring that young black men and women could walk down the street without the constant fear of being targeted by those who were supposed to protect them. One evening, as Marcus sat with Mia and Rachel at the dinner table, he received a phone call. It was Chief Anderson. The conversation was short, but when Marcus hung up, a small, satisfied smile played on his lips. "What happened?" Maya asked, her eyes widening. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "They're suspending Wilkins indefinitely. There's talk of criminal charges being filed." Mia's face lit up, but Marcus raised a hand to temper the celebration. "It's not over yet. But it's a big step in the right direction. We're not stopping until there's real accountability. The reckoning. Weeks passed, and the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus Collins had been fighting battles his entire career, battles against crime, injustice, and the systemic flaws within law enforcement itself. But this was different. This wasn't just a professional mission. It was deeply personal. The fight against Officer Wilkins had morphed into a full-blown movement. What started as a single incident involving his daughter, Mia, had exploded into a citywide demand for justice, for change. The protests continued, growing in size and intensity. People from all walks of life came together, united by the common goal of holding Wilkins accountable and exposing the department's complicity in covering up his misconduct. The media storm showed no signs of abating, and every day brought new revelations about Wilkins's history of racial profiling and abuse of power. Other victims had come forward, emboldened by the courage of Mia and her family, willing to speak out against the system that had protected Wilkins for so long. But Marcus knew that real change was never easy. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and while the public outcry was loud, the system they were fighting against was deeply entrenched. He also knew the stakes were higher than ever. This was no longer just about one cop. It was about systemic reform and dismantling the structures that allowed people like Wilkins to thrive. One chilly morning, as Marcus prepared for another long day of meetings and media appearances, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He glanced at the screen and saw it was Janelle. Her tone was urgent. "They're calling a grand jury hearing," she said quickly, without preamble. Marcus froze, the weight of her words sinking in. A grand jury meant the investigation had reached a critical point. It was the step that could lead to formal criminal charges against Officer Wilkins. "When?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. "Next week. We've got to prepare," Janelle said. "This is it, Marcus. This is our shot at getting real justice." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. This was what they had been fighting for, the chance to put Wilkins on trial, to make him answer for what he had done not just to Mia, but to all the others he had terrorized. But he also knew the road ahead would be grueling. Grand juries were unpredictable, and the system was still stacked in favor of law enforcement. After hanging up the phone, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow over the yard. He thought about everything that had led them to this moment. The humiliation Mia had endured, the late nights spent combing through evidence, the anger and pain that had fueled their fight. Now it all came down to what happened next. Mia walked into the kitchen, still groggy from sleep, and poured herself a cup of tea. She sat down across from her father, noticing the serious look on his face. "Dad, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Marcus looked at her for a moment, seeing not just the scared young girl who had been falsely accused, but a strong, resilient woman who had faced her fears and refused to be broken by them. "There's going to be a grand jury hearing next week," Marcus said quietly. "It's a big step. They're going to decide whether or not to indict Wilkins." Mia's eyes widened. "So, he might actually face charges?" Marcus nodded. "If they indict him, it means there's enough evidence to bring him to trial. It's not a guarantee of a conviction, but it's a start. It's more than what most people get in cases like this." Mia sat back in her chair, absorbing the news. She felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The possibility of Wilkins being held accountable was a victory, but it also brought back memories of that day, memories she had tried so hard to bury. "Do you think they'll do it?" Maya asked, her voice small but hopeful. Marcus paused before answering. He wanted to protect her, to tell her that everything would turn out the way they wanted, that justice would prevail. But he knew better than to make promises in a system as unpredictable as this one. "I think we've done everything we can to make sure the truth is out there," Marcus said slowly. "We've exposed him for what he is. Now it's up to the grand jury." The following week felt like an eternity. Marcus worked tirelessly with Janelle, and a team of civil rights lawyers preparing for the grand jury hearing. They gathered witness testimonies, evidence, and documentation, ready to present a rock-solid case that would leave no doubt in the minds of the jurors. They knew the department would be doing everything in its power to protect Wilkins, but Marcus was prepared to fight with every ounce of strength he had left. As the day of the hearing approached, the tension within the Collins household grew. Mia tried to keep herself busy with schoolwork and hanging out with friends, but her mind kept wandering back to the hearing. She knew her father had been fighting for her, for their family, and for the community. But a part of her still feared that the system, flawed as it was, might fail them. On the morning of the hearing, Marcus dressed in his sharpest suit, his face set in a mask of determination. Maya and Rachel watched him from the kitchen as he prepared to leave. He looked every bit the warrior he was, a man ready to go to battle for what was right. "You okay, Dad?" Maya asked, her voice filled with pride and concern. Marcus nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. This is what we've been working for." Rachel stepped forward and hugged him tightly, whispering, "We're with you, no matter what." The grand jury hearing took place behind closed doors, as was standard procedure. Marcus and Janelle were not allowed inside, but they had submitted their evidence, and the lawyers they had worked with presented their case on behalf of Mia and the other victims. Marcus paced the hallway outside the courtroom, his mind racing with possibilities. Would the jurors see through the police department's attempts to downplay Wilkins's actions? Would they understand the full scope of the damage he had caused? Hours passed, and Marcus's frustration grew. He knew these things took time, but waiting in the sterile hallway, knowing that the fate of the case rested in the hands of strangers, was torture. Finally, the doors opened, and the lawyers emerged. Marcus could tell by the look on their faces that something significant had happened. He held his breath as they approached. "They're indicting him," one of the lawyers said, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Wilkins is going to trial." Marcus exhaled, the tension in his body releasing all at once. It wasn't over, but it was a monumental step forward. The grand jury had seen the truth, and now Wilkins would have to face a jury of his peers in open court. It was a victory, hard-fought and long-awaited. As Marcus left the courthouse, he called Mia. "They're indicting him," he said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and triumph. On the other end of the line, Mia let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. She had been bracing herself for disappointment, but now, for the first time in weeks, she felt a surge of hope. "Dad, that's amazing," she whispered. "I can't believe it." "You did this, Mia," Marcus said softly. "You were brave enough to speak out, and now we're one step closer to justice." The trial of Officer Darren Wilkins became a national headline. The city was abuzz with the prospect of justice finally being served. The evidence against Wilkins was overwhelming. Bodycam footage, witness testimonies, and a pattern of behavior that painted a clear picture of a man who had used his position to target and harass vulnerable people of color. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back of the room, and members of the community came to show their support for the victims. Mia, sitting between her father and mother, felt the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of everything they had fought for. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, showing how Wilkins had abused his power time and again, how he had used racial profiling to justify his actions, and how the department had turned a blind eye to his misconduct for years. The defense tried to paint Wilkins as a misunderstood officer who had been doing his job, but the evidence was irrefutable. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated for 2 tense days. Marcus, Rachel, and Mia waited anxiously for the verdict, their emotions running high. Mia couldn't help but think back to that fateful day in the jewelry store, the day that had changed her life. She had been scared and humiliated, but now she felt something different. She felt empowered, knowing that her voice had been heard and that her family had stood by her every step of the way. The jury returned its verdict on a Friday afternoon. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide Wilkins's fate. On the charge of misconduct and abuse of power, we find the defendant guilty. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Mia's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes as the weight of the moment hit her. Wilkins had been found guilty. Justice had been served. Marcus leaned over and hugged his daughter tightly, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "We did it," he whispered. Rachel squeezed Mia's hand, her face a mixture of pride and relief. They had fought for this moment, and they had won.